Night. The dark streets of the city are engulfed in thick shadows. Passing cars rush by like flashes of fire, ignoring those who get lost in the night gloom. The streets do not forgive the weak. They hide them like forgotten pages of history, making them disappear into the shadows, leaving no one to worry. Angela sits in her wheelchair on the curb, her hands clenched around the handles, trying to keep her balance as she slowly, almost imperceptibly, moves forward. She has only one way to go. Home. Far away, warm, but perhaps still a little forgotten. She's long since gotten used to nighttime walks, those empty streets, that cold when even the air feels stiff and dangerous. But tonight is something different. Anxiety pervades her like an invisible shadow, and she can't understand where the feeling comes from. Her whole life is a constant expectation that something unexpected might happen. So, basically, it's nothing new. She stops the wheelchair for a moment to get her thoughts in order. Each turn of the steering wheel is difficult. Each stretch of road seems longer than usual. Somewhere in her head, the thought, "Hurry up, Angela." But something still makes her hesitate. Maybe she just doesn't want to be out there, on that road where her life could once again be jeopardized. Maybe she feels that today will be different. Somewhere in the distance, she hears the sound of a car getting closer by the second. She casts a quick glance to the side, watching as two headlights cut through the darkness, stopping beside her. Her heart starts to beat faster, but she can't figure out what exactly is causing this panic. The street is empty. The car's flashing lights flare, illuminating her for a few seconds, and she realizes that this encounter will not be a coincidence. But what should she do? Quickly continue on her way, or let this car get closer? She tries to push the anxiety away, but her instincts tell her otherwise. The car slows down. Angela turns her head and sees the window roll down. It's like everything around her is slowing down. Did he really notice her? That look, so cold, so fierce. The policeman behind the wheel looks straight at her. His face expresses neither surprise nor sympathy. He just reaches for the doorknob. "What are you doing here?" His voice sounded harsh, like a punch. "What are you, a criminal?" He doesn't notice her vulnerability. He doesn't notice that she's in a wheelchair, that she has nowhere to run. To him, she's just an object, just a black person who doesn't belong on this street this late at night. Angela tries to pull herself together, but something inside her, something ancient and animal, tells her that she is in danger. She feels her heart clench. Her fingers begin to slide over the handles of the wheelchair, but she can't take a step. And then there's this question, abrupt and unceremonious, like a sharp pain. Why does he say that? Why does she feel as if she's already guilty? What do you want? She can barely contain her voice, but it sounds weak. This man in front of her is like a stone wall. He's not waiting for her explanation. He has already made a decision that recognizes no truth, no pity. To him, she's a criminal, someone who can be accused of anything. The speed at which everything was happening is staggering. In the blink of an eye, a patrol car pulls its shiny headlights out of the shadows and stops right on top of Angela. It was as if the night itself took a breath, and at that moment all sounds disappeared. There was only her and this car, which with every meter approached her more and more, like a condemning judge. Angela doesn't even have time to swallow when the car finally stops right in front of her. The noise of the brakes breaks the silence. Her whole world shrinks into the dim light of the headlights. She clenches her fingers on the handles of her wheelchair, her breathing becoming more frequent. She feels her pulse go into her neck as fear grows, filling her body. Finally, the car door opens. At first, Angela sees only feet, tall, black boots, like blocks of stone, leaving no choice. He appears from behind the car, a huge silhouette, as if the city itself is spilling out into the night. A policeman, tall, muscular, with dark glasses and a stern, unreadable expression. His face seems wooden. He is like a statue, devoid of emotion, a silent monument to authority. He stepped closer, and his gaze met hers immediately. Angela felt something break in her chest. No, he doesn't see a person in front of him. He doesn't see a girl in a wheelchair. He only sees a potential criminal. His eyes are merciless. His gaze doesn't take into account her weakness, her vulnerability. It's just a case on the street that, like all others, must be dealt with by the rules. "What are you doing here at this late hour?" His voice is cold as steel, and she can feel him filling her every word with anger and suspicion. Angela tries to pull herself together, but her throat is dry and her fingers on the handles of the wheelchair begin to tremble. She wants to say something, but the words seem to get stuck in her throat. This can't all be real. But this policeman wasn't waiting for an explanation anymore. He looks down at her, showing no sympathy or understanding. His words come out again. "What are you doing here, girl?" he asks, ignoring her disability. "Are you aware that this street at night is no place for the likes of you?" Every word spoken by this man is like a knife stabbing into her soul. He has no interest in her condition. He doesn't care that her body can't move the way it should. He only sees her as a threat. I'm going home." Angela finally finds the strength to answer, her voice shaking, but she clenches her teeth, trying to hold on. "You don't look like you're just going home." He doesn't believe it. His eyes pierce her like the point of a knife. He doesn't look at her eyes. He doesn't notice her pain. He only sees her skin color, her position. Angela feels her face begin to redden with humiliation. He can't understand. He doesn't want to understand. He keeps interrogating her as if she's already guilty. He comes in from the other side, as if he's trying to find another reason to blame her. And then he doesn't stop. "You should probably explain what you're doing here unless you want me to call for backup." His words become threatening. She can't move any faster, can't run away because she's here, in a wheelchair. Her fear begins to turn to despair. But what can she do? How can she prove she's not guilty? He has already passed judgment. To him, she is not a person, but a suspect. He takes a step forward, too close. His presence fills the space, his figure becoming even more menacing. For a moment, it seems as if he will simply move on. But no. He stops, looking at her with a troubled but no less contemptuous expression. "You don't want me to check up on you, do you?" His words sound like a threat, like a promise Angela can't ignore. Every move he makes, every word he says begins to feel like a decision, and Angela feels the ground go out from under her feet. Her mind begins to spin. It's all too fast, and she can't figure out what comes next. But she knows one thing for sure. She is here, and she is the only person who should be looking for a way out of this abyss. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from. Have you ever had similar situations in your life? We'd love to hear what you think. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. Now, let's get on with it. Every word of the policeman is like a heavy blow to her chest. Angela feels her strength leaving her more and more. She wants to say something, but her voice grows weaker with every moment, with every look this man gives her. He is not listening to her. He doesn't hear her. She is not a person to him. He sees only her skin color and her position. Her disability doesn't matter. Her explanations don't matter. All he sees in front of him is a criminal. "What? You think I can't see you're a criminal?" His words fall like stones across her nerves. He looks at her with such contempt that it becomes hard to breathe. Angela clenched her hands on the handles of her wheelchair, but the harder she did, the more she felt her fingers disobeying her. He can't hear her words. He can't see her condition. She doesn't deserve attention because she's black and helpless. Her breathing became more and more rapid. Her heart was pounding in her chest, and the policeman's eyes were filled with nothing but contempt and rage. He doesn't give her time to explain, his eyes glinting like knife points. He wants to find a crime in her. He is looking for a reason to blame her, to humiliate her, to put her in her place. Angela can't hide her weakness. Her body can't run away. Her body can't protect her. "What? Am I wrong?" he continues, his voice growing harder, as if he believes it himself. He leans a little closer, almost hovering over her, not caring about her wheelchair, not interested in the fact that her body can't move fast enough. He looks at her like a criminal whose life is worthless. All these questions are not requests. They are accusations. "What are you, selling drugs? Or maybe you're here to rob someone?" His questions sound like instruments of humiliation. Every question he asks is a step closer to destroying everything she ever believed about justice. Angela tries to swallow, but it doesn't help. Something clenches in her chest, something that grows tighter with every word the policeman says. He can't even give her a chance. He doesn't see the person. He only sees her as a threat, as something to be fought. Her whole explanation disappears into the void, finding no response in his heart. "You think you're going to get away with this?" His voice sounds increasingly threatening. He doesn't give her an answer because his answer is ready. His mind is made up. He doesn't give her a way out. Angela feels her hands begin to sweat, the pain building in her chest. She wants to back away, wants to fight off his words somehow, but her wheelchair restricts her movements. She can't get away from him, can't hide in the shadows. All she has is this horrible moment, this look she can't avoid. "You're not going to tell me who put you up here," the policeman continues. His tone no longer hides his aggression. He is looking for an enemy, and she has become one. In his eyes, she is not a person, but only an object to be punished. And she feels her soul shrinking with humiliation. It's not just a matter of power. It is a cruel and inhuman way of showing her that she is insignificant, that her rights are worthless. The policeman doesn't see the person in front of him. He only sees his target to be destroyed. All she can do is try not to burst into tears in front of this monster, trying to contain her weakness, not to show how vulnerable she is. "Are you going to answer?" His words sound like threats, like incitement. She can't escape it, but she needs to hold on. In that moment, she realizes that all she has is her strength inside. But in the face of this brutal pressure, that strength seems quite small, pathetic. The policeman standing in front of Angela did not take his eyes off her. His gaze was like a knife, cutting through her soul, leaving behind pain. His footsteps drew closer. Each new step seemed not just a threat, but a promise that everything she had ever known about justice would vanish into the void. He knew no pity. He saw no human being. He saw only a criminal to be punished. "What are you babbling about?" His voice became loud, aggressive, echoing in the empty street. He stepped even closer, and now she could feel his breath burning her face. Angela felt her body clench, felt herself become even more helpless than before. She tried to back away, to push the wheelchair away, but where was she to retreat to? Every movement only confirmed her helplessness, her weakness. She couldn't just leave. She had no way out. Her heart beat faster and faster in her chest, and her thoughts became more and more disordered. It wasn't her fault. She just wanted to go home. But how could she explain that to someone who had already made up his mind? Every answer she gave, every word out of her mouth only added fuel to the fire, only made the cop more aggressive. She could have kept silent, but her soul, her instincts, wouldn't let her keep silent. "I'm not doing anything wrong." Her voice shook, but she tried to be confident despite this growing terror. "I'm just going home. Please let me go." But his face didn't change. He looked at her as if her words didn't exist. "Oh, really?" His laugh was mocking and cruel. "You expect me to believe you're just rolling around here at night in the city? Maybe you're hiding something, aren't you? You're not as harmless as you seem." He leaned forward, his eyes never taking his eyes off her. Angela felt his words stabbing into her like a whip that tore at her soul. He didn't know that behind her words was only a desire to go home, to be safe. But it didn't matter to him. His gaze was full of contempt, and her words were nothing but empty sounds to him. He began to scream, almost not realizing what he was doing. So much was his rage overwhelming him. "You're hiding something. You're hiding something, and I know it. Why aren't you answering normally, huh?" His voice sounded louder and louder, like a thunderstorm ready to descend on her. Every word he said was like a blow, and she couldn't escape. His accusations filled her, squeezing her soul. Her mind began to reel with thoughts that he was never going to listen to her, that her explanations didn't matter to him. He had already made up his mind. He saw her as a threat, as a danger, and now nothing she said would change his mind. "Did you think I wouldn't notice? Did you think I didn't know what you were hiding in here?" He shrieked even louder, starting to rip something out of his uniform, approaching her with a fierce stare. Angela felt her body clench with fear. Her hands clenched on the handles of the wheelchair, but she couldn't move. Even if she could stand up, her weakness was her enemy. He had gotten so close that she could smell his scent, hear his fierce breathing. His contempt was so obvious that her eyes filled with tears. "I'm not hiding anything. Just let me go." Her voice was almost crying, but she couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. Fear, pain, humiliation, all of it clenched her heart into an iron fist. She screamed, but her words, as before, did not resonate in his heart. He stops for a moment, but not because his words hurt her, but because he's starting to feel his control slipping away. He can't stop himself. This moment turns into an escalation where his own beliefs become so strong that they almost prevent him from seeing the truth. "You're just like everyone else," he adds with fury in his voice, and Angela feels her hands begin to shake with fear. He has no intention of stopping. In that moment, everything around her disappears for her. All that remains are his words, his aggression, and her helplessness. She can't escape it, can't escape from this horrifying nightmare in which she is being strangled by her own words. Angela didn't even have time to realize what was happening when the policeman tugged at her shoulder without warning, pulling her out of the wheelchair as if her body was nothing but a useless weight. The moment his hand touched hers, something inside her exploded. The rage, the fear, the anger she had held back for so long. Her body clenched, but there was no strength to resist. She screamed, a loud, piercing scream, but it didn't stop him. On the contrary, it only fueled his rage. He didn't listen to her. He paid no attention to her complaints. He continued to yank her, not caring that she was in a wheelchair, that her body couldn't get up and move as fast as he wanted it to. His gaze filled with hatred, and his movements became even more rough and abrupt. "What do you think you're doing?" His voice was hoarse with anger. His hand clenched on her shoulder so hard she felt her muscles begin to ache from the increasing pressure. He doesn't see the man in front of him. He sees a criminal to be punished. He sees his victim, his prey. Angela tried to break free, her arm flailing for support, but her weak body couldn't evade his violent thrusts. With each movement, her wheelchair spun like a toy in his hands. She couldn't hold it in place. Pain squeezed her chest. Every time she tried to regain control, he would pull her shoulder again, causing her to literally fall out of the wheelchair. She could feel her strength draining away, her body starting to lose control. "You can't escape even if you wanted to," he shouted, his words filled with not just anger, but resentment. She couldn't help but notice the contempt burning in his eyes, the way his hands grabbed her with such violence as if she wasn't human. It wasn't just physical violence, it was a humiliation that overshadowed everything. In his eyes, she was not just a girl, but a criminal to be destroyed. Her pain was like fire, penetrating every cell in her body. As her body touched the ground, she felt her joints begin to break under the brutal impact. She clenched her teeth to keep from screaming, to keep from showing her vulnerability, but her breathing became rapid and shallow, as if she was short of air. He kept talking, kept insulting her, accusing her of doing something illegal, accusing her of crimes she hadn't committed. She felt his words digging harder and harder into her mind. But they couldn't kill her. They couldn't take away her human dignity, which was still alive in her. "You think you're going to get away with what you did?" He leaned toward her, his face only a few centimeters away from hers, and his breath barely grazed her face. "You just need to be taught to respect the law." But it wasn't about the law. It was about power. It was about making her feel like she was nothing, making her realize who was in charge. His violence had no logic. It was driven only by hatred and racism. He didn't see a woman in front of him. He didn't see a human being with dignity in front of him. He saw her as an object to be humiliated. Angela felt like her body couldn't take it anymore. Every movement gave her more and more pain, her shoulder burning from his hand, her heart pounding in her chest, and fear clenching her insides. She realized that if she didn't break free, if she didn't find the strength, it would all end this moment, the moment when she would finally lose control of her life. But suddenly she felt someone intervene, someone from behind her. A light whisper, almost invisible to someone who was consumed by her rage, cut through the fog of fear. At that moment, something changed. But what it was, Angela couldn't understand yet. Angela felt her body losing control with every movement. She tried to break free, but her strength was running out. Her hands, which a few minutes ago could grip the handles of the wheelchair with firm determination, were now as weak as rags. The policeman tugged at her, forcing her out of the wheelchair without thinking about her pain, about her condition. To him, she was just an object for punishment, for humiliation. He did not see before him a person who was suffering. He saw only a criminal who deserved to be punished, and her attempts to resist only fueled his rage. Her legs couldn't take it. She could feel her muscles losing strength, her spine breaking under his rough jerks. She could hear his furious screams, but they were distant, like echoes lost in space. The policeman did not stop his movements. His hands clenched on her body, and her attempts to shove away were futile. He was too strong, and she was too weak. With each new jerk, her body collapsed even more. She felt her chest constrict with fear, her heart unable to withstand the hatred she was being subjected to. At that moment, she felt the ground beneath her begin to disappear. It wasn't just a fall. It was a fall into an abyss, into a void where there was nothing but humiliation and pain. There was no more strength. She could feel her body simply failing, her legs losing their footing, and when his tug was finally decisive, she found herself on the cold asphalt. The impact was as heavy as lightning, and she felt all her energy drain away. The fall into darkness, into an abyss where there was no light, no hope, left her breathless. She lay on the cold asphalt, feeling her body ache in every place, her soul screaming in pain, but silent. There was no room in her mind for words, no room for resistance. She just lay there, like a helpless toy thrown to the ground. But what was worse than the pain in her body was the pain in her soul. She realized that it wasn't just physically that she had been humiliated. She realized that her strength was broken. She was helpless, and it wasn't just a physical defeat. She realized that no one could help her. This policeman, this man who stood over her, knew no pity. He saw her as nothing but a criminal in need of punishment. Her heart clenched at the realization. She wasn't just a victim. She was a testament to how society had stopped noticing her as a person, how her life was worthless. He didn't see her disability. He didn't see her pain. He only saw her skin color, and that was enough to turn her into an object to be bullied and abused. The policeman stood beside her, his gaze ruthless. He looked at her as if she were useless, as if she were an object to be destroyed. He didn't notice her fear, her pain. He was so sure he was right that he may never have realized how he had broken her. Angela could do nothing more. She lay on the pavement, her body aching, her soul destroyed. All she could do was stare into the void, feeling her life slipping out from under her. Let's take another quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, whether you have ever had similar experiences or situations in your life. We'd love to hear your experiences. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the continuation. Now, let's get on with it. Angela lay on the asphalt, unable to move, her body refusing to obey. There was only one fire in the policeman's eyes, rage, his hand clutching his baton, and she could already feel that another blow was just around the corner. He stood over her, ready to punish her for just being in the right place at the right time. He didn't see her pain, her humiliation. He saw only his victory. She was nothing more than a shadow stretching across the pavement. But to him, that shadow deserved to be punished. But before that brutal blow could land on her body, there came a loud and confident voice from the shadows. "Stop!" The policeman turned sharply. He could have expected anything, perhaps another passerby or another witness, but not this man. The man who had emerged from the darkness stood with a confident posture, his voice as hard as stone. The policeman froze for a moment, and his gaze suddenly changed. He saw more than just some random passerby. He saw a threat, and the threat was none other than the police chief himself. Angela, lying on the cold asphalt, did not immediately realize that it was her father. He appeared at that moment like a shadow that overshadowed everything. There was not aggression in his eyes, but unconcealed power, confidence in his words. But most importantly, in that moment, as his figure froze in the bright light of the street lamps, she realized that this man was her father. It was him, the one who stood above all those policemen, the one who was her protection, her protector. The policeman, who had just been ready to strike the next blow, now felt his world turn upside down. He looked at the man, and his face turned stony, a face that tried to hide shock and confusion. He certainly hadn't expected this. How could he have known that the man in front of him was not just a man, but a man who could turn his whole life upside down in the blink of an eye? "Don't you know who you're talking to?" came her father's voice, cold and hard, making the policeman feel guilty with every word. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a random passerby, he was the chief of police, his boss. The policeman tried to justify himself, but his words sounded hollow. His face turned pale, and he didn't know what to do. This moment was worse than any punishment he could have received. He had been caught in a trap, and his actions had just become a crime that now had to be paid for. I didn't know it was your daughter." His voice shook and he took a step back, averting his gaze. He didn't know what to say because his mistake had become all too obvious. He saw the force change its side, how his own fate now depended on the decision of the man he had so often ignored. Angela couldn't believe her eyes. Everything was happening too fast. She was lying on the pavement, unable to get up, but her mind, like a paralysis, was able to grasp one important moment. Her father. That moment was a twist she hadn't expected. And now, watching the policeman retreat with a worried expression on his face, she realizes that this moment will change her life forever. "Have you forgotten for a moment who you are?" Her father glared at the policeman, and his gaze was so hard that he literally backed away. Angela heard his words leave an icy trail in the air. The police had always been about power, but now, in this scene, Angela could feel the power itself clutching the policeman, how her father had become the one who would bring him to justice. "Take her to the car," Angela's father said, his voice no longer leaving room for questions. The policeman was convicted not only by his actions, but by his inability to recognize who stood before him. This was the moment when all his confidence crumbled. The policeman stood motionless, his eyes unable to believe what they were seeing. He couldn't realize what had just happened, that now everything that had seemed obvious to him had instantly turned into a terrifying delusion. He looked back at the man in front of him, his superior, whom he had never known and never seemed to want to know. The gaze of this man, Angela's father, was now focused and full of an authority that the policeman could not ignore. He saw in front of him not just a superior officer, but someone who was literally the master of destinies. Angela lay on the pavement, her body still sore from the fall, and she couldn't believe that her rescue had come so unexpectedly. But even if her father had been there, he had come too late to prevent the horror she had endured. All this time she had hoped that someone would pay attention to her suffering, that someone would see what was happening. And now that moment had come, but with such shock and tension that even she couldn't realize how her life could change in 1 second. The policeman took a step back, his face pale and his gaze confused. He now realized that he was standing in front of someone who had the power to wipe out his career with a single word. He had just attacked the police chief's daughter, and all his confidence vanished in an instant. His hands, which had just been clutching a baton, were now down, and he looked like a little boy caught in the act of crime. His eyes reflected not shame, but fear. He didn't know what would happen to him now, but one thing was certain. His actions were the beginning of his end. You are. The policeman could only utter, his voice trembling. He couldn't say the full question, couldn't find the words to express his shock. He didn't know what to do, how to justify himself now, how to return to the rules that had always seemed so obvious to him. His gaze slid to Angela lying on the pavement. He saw how her face was contorted in pain, how her body reacted weakly to every gust of air, how she barely kept her eyes open. He realized that his actions had turned this girl into a victim. And now that victim belonged to whoever stood before him, his superior. The man standing in front of the policeman looked at him with icy determination. Every step he took, every word he said was palpable and powerful, and to the policeman it was like a nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. Everything that was happening suddenly seemed to him like a strange, paradoxical dream in which he was the main villain and his actions were irreversible. "How dare you touch my daughter?" Her father's voice sounded firm, but there was a depth to it that hid not only rage but icy calculation. He looked at the policeman as a subordinate, as one who could no longer serve. His words left no chance of justification. It was not mere remorse, it was a judgment. The policeman tried to justify himself, but his words were lost in the air, unanswered. He said he didn't know it was his daughter, that he was furious, that he thought she was a criminal. But all these excuses now seemed empty to him. He realized that his actions were not just a mistake, it was not just a misconception. It was a crime. Angela felt her body weaken, but her mind, on the contrary, became clearer. She realized that her father could bring justice back, but the question remained. How would that make her life? She felt that her soul, her strength, all went to the edge of this abyss. She could no longer just watch her life crumble. You broke every possible rule, and now you're going to pay for it. Angela's father said those words with complete confidence, and there was genuine determination in his eyes. He didn't know what would happen to this policeman now, but one thing was certain. He wouldn't get out of this without consequences, and for his victim, his daughter, this day was the moment of truth. The policeman stood with his eyes downcast, unable to meet his gaze. He couldn't help but realize that he had lost everything: his career, his reputation, and, most importantly, his own pride. His life was now a crumbling wall that couldn't withstand the first blow. There was only one question in his mind. How did he end up in this nightmare? Angela raised her eyes with difficulty, and her gaze crossed with her father's. Her soul felt something inside her change in that moment. It wasn't just salvation. It was the moment when her life, her pain, became the forces that could change the world around her. It didn't take long for the police to react, but now that the situation had gone beyond a mere incident, the consequences were far more serious than anyone could have imagined. Angela's father, the one who was himself the arbiter of justice, stood in front of the policeman with full determination. He could no longer allow this to become just another minor mistake to be erased from his memory. Everything that had happened could no longer be simply forgiven or forgotten. This was the decisive moment. The policeman had to be punished. The man, who just a few minutes ago had been a policeman, now stood before him like a criminal. The same man who had worn a uniform and was confident in his immunity now stood with a faded look, as if he had lost all confidence in himself. He tried to justify himself, but there was no point anymore. All he could say sounded like pathetic attempts to hide the truth. He couldn't hide anywhere else, not from the law, not from the consequences of his actions. This wasn't just a case that could be hushed up. This was a crime, and now he had to pay for it. The police began their investigation, but it was too late for it to seem neutral. Angela's father was too powerful a man, and even those who tried to silence the case realized that nothing could be hidden. The whole system around him began to shake like a house of cards that had suddenly been undermined. The cop, who had once been proud of his career, now found himself at the center of an investigation that could destroy not only him, but his career and his entire life. But more than that, it was a moment that couldn't help but affect the system of which this police officer was a part. Everyone involved in this incident was now under scrutiny. The policeman was stripped of all his privileges, his position was revoked, and his life would never go back to the way it was before. Everything happened so quickly that even the policeman himself did not have time to realize how his world was shattered. He felt his career fading away, his reputation crumbling, his life slowly beginning to disintegrate. He was no longer the strong and confident man who had once stood up for the law. Now his own life had become his worst enemy. All of his actions, all of his cruel deeds were now his curse. When he was handed over to the other officers to begin the investigation, his face was downcast. He could no longer look anyone in the eye, especially not his superior, especially not the one who had just been willing to save his own daughter. He was no longer a cop, he was a criminal, and now all he had to do was wait for his punishment. Angela's father didn't stop. He demanded that every moment, every step of the investigation be controlled. He couldn't allow something like this to go without consequence. He knew that this policeman, like all the others, was part of a system that had allowed his actions to develop into something terrible. But now, in this momentary denouement, he realized that if he did not punish this man, his own leadership, his own duty to his family, to the citizens of the city, would be violated. Angela couldn't believe that her father was willing to go to such lengths. He, like any other man, had once been idealized in her eyes, but now she saw that his strength and power knew no compromise. It was unexpected, even for her. Her own life was now a part of history that could no longer be turned back. She, like so many others, felt the pain of what had happened, but she also realized justice would be served. This police officer had to be held accountable, and despite the horrors she had endured, she knew that her life would now be headed toward recovery. As the policeman was led away, his face was no longer so confident. His shoulders were hunched, and he could no longer look at those around him, including her father, who was at the center of it all. He was just a weak man who had lost everything he had, and now his future hung in the balance. He was about to go through a severe trial. His life had crumbled like a house of cards, and now his world was shattered to the ground. Angela rode home in her wheelchair, and every roll felt like a heavy blow, like a step into an abyss in which everything was broken. Every turn of her wheelchair reverberated with pain in her body. She could feel her muscles tense, her arms unable to hold the force that was piercing her, but it didn't matter so much. In that moment, as the wheels of the wheelchair slid across the pavement, her soul was deeper than physical pain. It was anger. It was an anger she couldn't just let go. It was an anger that couldn't be forgiven. It wasn't a victory. It was a struggle to survive in a world that had always put her in a position of being weak and invisible. She couldn't forget what had happened. Her heart was still beating too fast from the fear, from the pain, from everything she had experienced. But more importantly, she felt this anger, this realization of injustice, overwhelm her. It wasn't going away. It wasn't something to just forget. To forget how easily her life could have been destroyed by a single police officer. And even though her father had achieved justice, it wasn't enough for her to feel a real victory. It was something more. It was a fight for honor, for the freedom to be herself. She drove down familiar streets, but every shadow, every face she saw seemed alien now. The world around her had changed, but not because anything about it had improved. She realized that the world would always be unfair. Only her family's strength gave her a chance to survive it. But at what cost? The scars that were left in her body would remain forever, just like the scars in her soul. She couldn't just forget what had happened. It was deeper than physical pain. It was a blow to her essence, to her right to be human, to her right to be respected, to be loved. Every movement of the wheelchair was like a replay of old memories, like memories of how she had tried to break free from this web of cruelty and how little chance she had had. But now, as she drove home, her thoughts were so full that she could barely control them. A multitude of thoughts that were like fire, burning her from the inside out. She had survived this moment, and now she realized that she wasn't just a victim. She wasn't allowing herself to be just a victim. She couldn't allow herself to be weak anymore. Her gaze was hard, despite the physical pain that reverberated so vividly through her body. This journey home wasn't just a return to a place where she could feel safe. It was a journey that marked her struggle, to fight against something that had been forced upon her since she was a child, something that the world had always put her in a position where she was weak, vulnerable. She knew now that this wasn't just an accident. It was something more than her strength. It had been given to her. She couldn't let anyone else fall victim to the system that was ruining her and her life. As she approached her house, her face was calm, but a hurricane was raging inside her. She realized that this fight was not over. Even though the policeman had been punished, she knew it wasn't over. There was a realization in her soul that she would not be able to forget what had happened. But this silence after the storm was not an emptiness. It was a silence in which she had to find her strength, her purpose, her future. Angela stopped her wheelchair in front of the house and sighed. She looked back at the path she had traveled and felt her shoulders finally relax, but the pain still burned inside. She couldn't help but think about what had happened, couldn't help but think about what she had been through. But her thoughts were different now. This wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't justice. It was the realization that she, like her family, had the power to change this world. But in what way? And at what price? These questions remained unanswered. There was only one conclusion in her soul. She would fight. She would fight to change the world around her, so that she could be herself, without fear, without humiliation. And though her journey was full of pain and fear, she was not ready to stop. She was ready to keep going, no matter what. The scars will remain, but they will no longer hold her back. They will become part of her power. We really value your opinion and would like to know what you think about this story. Have you experienced racist incidents in your life that left a mark? Share your thoughts in the comments. They are very important to us. We value each and every one of you and always welcome your opinion. If you like the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and put a like. This helps us to keep creating interesting and important stories for you. We wish you a good day. Write the phrase, "I'm here until the end," in the comments so we can understand that you listened to this story to the very end. Your opinion is very important to us.